All right. Thanks, Kala. I think we all know what has been happening in AI space, and all of the new development in AI-assisted coding. So I asked this question. The term is little new, vibe coding. Probably you haven't heard the term vibe coding. However, it simply refers to AI-assisted coding. We pretty much started with some Devin type of demos some time back, and then GitHub had copilots, and now we have much sophisticated agents such as Cursor and Windsurf. So let me share my screen. Today I don't have PowerPoints today, but I'll pretty much go through some of the some demos and some coding together. If you have any question, please feel free to raise your voice or post it on the chat. All right. Vibe coding. I think we all we had at least heard about the impact AI is doing on software development. If you haven't, because there's like almost 44% of the respondents are saying they are new to this subject. So basically, in coding today, you have IDEs or IDE plugins, which are augmented with AI. Like what you are seeing here is a VS Code adaptation called Cursor. Probably most of you had heard about it and already using. But if you haven't, let me very quickly talk about how to use a AI-enabled editor, usual parts of such editor, and how would you get some work done at a very high productivity. The source code you are seeing is a typical project. It's an Angular application. The application basically looks like this. It's a fairly standard application with some pages. Let's say in this application, I need some changes to be done to the application, or if I need to develop a new component in this application. I'll show you how vibe coding or AI-assisted coding could work in a very quick demo. And then I'll talk about the limitations and the challenges of using vibe coding in large projects, and especially the projects we deal with, like product engineering, where standards and architecture integrity is of very high importance, the challenges we will face in vibe coding, and then how do you tackle it? So that is basically the structure of my presentation. I'll first show what vibe coding is, and then talk a little bit about challenges, and then talk about how we tackle that. Let's say I need to change this user interface. Here in settings, instead of having these settings components stacked one on another, I need them to be here as a tab component, right? And just imagine that as my requirement. So I mean, if you are a developer, you know that this could take some amount of time if you are to do it with the normal ways of coding. Of course, you need to get a UI designer to first design pretty much this workflow, and then understand the code and start looking at the components and start developing this one. So it can take a fair amount of time. But if you are using a good IDE like Cursor IDE, it is pretty straightforward for you to do something like that with a simple prompt. So this is where you enter prompts in Cursor. Cursor is the IDE I'm using, but you can use Windsurf or any other IDE. Usually you have multiple modes of cursor. Agentic mode is more like it can actually search the files for go through folders, understand code, even execute commands, can do quite a lot of things. But if you just want some knowledge, you can go with the ask mode. Or if you know exactly what to do, you might not need the agent. You can simply say, I just need this particular change to be done on the manual mode. But I'll use the agentic mode for now. So if I say, if you remember what I want to do now is to get a tabs instead of stacked components. So let me simply do a prompt, something like I want to change the visual visual presentation of settings where I have tabs, where I have, let's say, two tabs. I have this app server and flow server. I would say app server should be in one tab and the flow server should be in another, right? I think now I need to basically give it probably, I don't exactly need to give it, but more context you give to the agent, it will perform better. I can simply copy and paste, or at least drag and drop my settings component folder, which has basically a few of the settings components, rec components. If I do this, it should now read my settings files and components, and it will start doing the changes. So as you can see, it has actually got the work done in a second almost. Now I have flow server, app server, pretty much, yeah, of course, even within the component, things are working. I mean, this is vibe coding, right? The amount of productivity you can get in vibe coding could be actually 100 times in my experience, if you exactly know what you are doing, and if you exactly know what to look for, and if you know the domain, you can build applications within a week, which took us a year before, right? But you need to have the domain knowledge and all of that for you to do that. You need to be a good developer, of course. You can't really use tools like this without being a good developer, but the amount of productivity gain you get is massive. Now you have seen what vibe coding can do. I mean, it can basically do pretty much anything. Like even if I see if this is not mobile optimized, this is to fair extent. But if the whole application is mobile not optimized, I can actually ask the agent to make it mobile optimized. And there are many other ways you can use the agent. Like, for example, you can ask it to write a test suite and write code until the test suite passes. When you use the agent mode, it can access the command prompt and get the work done. It's a completely new way of developing a software today. I'll actually just accept it because I think I like the new format, so I'll just leave it as is. But what I'm going to talk about today is more about the challenges you will face in doing this. Especially when you have a large code base with already existing massive amount of existing code. One of the challenges the AI would face is the context size. If the code is massive, for it to load the total context into its processing. That's one of the challenges. And then I actually have something here. One is a limited context window size. The other issue you will face is how do we actually tell the agent what type of architecture we have? Because the agents, they had seen so many different architectures. When it generates the code, how do we ensure that they actually generate the code in the desired architecture I have? Another issue that could be the inconsistent, because the agent, you can actually use different models if you know which model works best for you. Like here, I usually use a Claude 3.7 in thinking mode, which works fairly well. But you can of course use any other model like GPT models from OpenAI. But when you have mixed models working, how do you ensure the quality and the consistency of the generated code? And of course, not to mention about if they don't understand the context, they hallucinate, and then it can lead to incorrect and inconsistent code, right? So this is one of the major fears architects are having when they talk about vibe coding. So far, if you have any question, please raise it on the chat, or feel free to disturb me. So what I'm going to discuss today is how do you tackle these challenges and still use vibe coding to be extremely productive. So what we had seen or what we learned by doing this for some time, there is a way you can tackle this. That mechanism is basically through developer documentation. Because when we think about Gen AI, we need to think about Gen AI more like a actual developer in this case, and then we need to question, all right, if I have extremely capable developer, how do I get that developer to understand my context of my code? What we had been practicing very successfully is to keep all the developer documentation, all the design architecture documentation within the code in markdown format, MD format. When you have your documentation in MD format, your agent is able to actually refer to the documentation and exactly implement the functionality in your desired architecture and the design. Then you can do this context-aware code generation. And then when you have more and more code, you will basically go with a feedback loop and update the documentation. So this process, so we call it a Go Vibe process. Basically, you start with something called IDE rules, which I'll show you in a while. Then you generate some, because usually when we get to any project, even a greenfield project, we start with some type of a code, like at least the architectural code. So you use the architectural code and you do the document generation. You have the developer docs and you use the developer docs in code generation. And then as you evolve your code, you update the documentation. So it's more like a loop. I will share this website with you probably tomorrow. But this website actually has information about each of these steps also, like how do you set up IDE rules and what do you mean by IDE rules? How do you do the document generation? How do you do context-aware code generation? And how do you evolve your documents once you have more code built in your system? So there are some documentation available, but let me not go through that, but I'll show you this in practice. So let's go back to our application. So in this application, what I showed you earlier was its front-end code, the React application, but it has a .NET backend as well. It's an API backend server, REST API backend server. So I'm going to switch to the backend, and I'll show you how effectively use vibe coding or Go vibe process in backend coding as well. So let's imagine I need to implement a new functionality, which is actually a real requirement in this application. I need tenants as a new entity and ability to manage tenants in this application, which I don't have as of now. You can see it has, this is the AI agentic orchestrator. It has agent definitions, it has agent runs, it has some agent knowledge, it has settings, but it does not have tenants. Right. What I'm going to show you next is, okay, where's my backend code? CN server. Okay, here we are. Let me clean up the IDE a little bit, close all data, and probably I'll hide this. Right. Okay, so what you're seeing is actually the backend of the that software. This is a typical .NET backend module or a project. You can see the data layer. So data layer has database schemas, and it has database repositories, and it has database models, like all of the entity classes. Like these are simply entity classes. And if I show you a repository, these are basically repository classes with CRUD operation, database repository classes. And on top of the database, you have a service layer. So these are basically services or business logic layers in between the API and the database. And on top of the services, you have endpoints. Endpoints are basically your REST endpoints. These are the REST endpoint URLs. It's a very standard backend application. The difference here from most of the other applications you might have seen that we keep our documentation in the repository itself as markdown files. Like for an example, okay, let me show you the index. This is the index of the documents. Basically, this talks about, this is my documentation. So it talks about how do you create database schemas, and there is a guideline document about database schemas, which is this one. And then how do you create database repositories? And there's a detailed guideline for creating database repositories. And then how do you create endpoints? And finally, how do you create Postman tests to test your implementation? So let's assume now I am given the task of implementing the backend for tenants functionality. When I'm given such a requirement, usually I get a brief requirement document, usually from Jira. But in this case, I just have it. A very simple doc, what you see here, is explaining what tenants are. Tenants, basically the system should have function to manage tenants. Tenants are different customers using this portal in a multi-tenant environment, and tenants has these properties. And it should have a API where we can update, delete, and retrieve tenants, right? So I mean, usually our requirement documents are a little more sophisticated than this, but I just created this one for this demo purpose. Now let's see how we implement this total functionality with vibe coding. But still, keeping the architectural integrity non-violated. How? Because all of these documentation I have, these are basically developer documentation. Like if I just open it with the preview, you will see these are simply developer documentation with samples and naming conventions, the data types we use, best practices of creating and common patterns, right? This is a normal developer documentation. And you might ask, okay, I don't have developer documentation in my project to this extent. But I didn't have either. So we simply selected some sample code areas and asked the agent to generate this documentation. So this is not written by hand. The documentation is generated within like 10 minutes by giving samples. So let's start. Let's start with creating the database schema for this particular requirement. I can say following guidelines at. Let me get the developer documentation for database schemas. Following guidelines at here, create DB schema for new entity called, let's say, tenants. The requirement specification for tenants is as follows. I can copy and paste it from Jira, but in this case, I simply have a file for this. And if I do this, the agent will now, it's actually do the planning. You can see thought for 4 seconds. It looked at the requirement and it identified the properties. And now it is creating my database schema, and it will actually create the database schema in a particular folder, which I did not tell it. The reason why I didn't tell the agent about the location is because it is actually documented in my document where the database schemas has to be created. Like if I show you this one again, somewhere here, you can see store it at database schemas. Now I have the schema file in. I can actually, it's asking me to create the, which is not needed actually, because it has already created the file. Hold on, why is it creating a collection? Now I'll create the, I have a feeling it has not read the database schemas.md in this case. Let me try this once more. Database schema.md. Following the guidelines and create database schema. Only create the schema JSON. Let's do it once more. Okay, it has created the file. Fantastic. Because this is a little new to me also. Usually it creates the file in the folder demo effect. Let me try without the thinking. Very interesting. I usually use this tool pretty much without any issue. Tenant as follows. So let me just drag drop this one. This is how it is to work with agents, just like working with developers. Sometimes you don't get exactly what you need. And that is why you need, as I said, you need a programmer in running this. And I can see it's actually not creating the file in the location. Let me do it a bit of a favor by creating the file by myself. Tenant schema.json. Right. So it has the logo, time zone, agents, permissions created at, yeah. Actually, a lot of these fields are coming from my documentation as common fields, like tenant ID and created at. All of that is in my documentation saying any schema should have these particular fields. So let's do the second step. Now I have the schemas. Now I need to create my repository layer, database repositories. So I'll do one other prompt, and I'm going to give it the second documentation I have, which is how to create DB repositories. Let's see if it gets that right this time. This is fairly strange. Following the documentation at create database repositories, generate the DB repos for tenants. Tenant schema is, now I have the schema which I generated a while ago.
Hasid, there's a typo, DB.
Yeah, thanks. Usually it will work around pretty much, but just to be safe, today doesn't seems to be a good day for AI. The schema has to be somewhere here, which I created, which also has a typo. That's okay. Generate the DB schema is, I'll drag and drop. And do I need to give the requirement also? I can also give the requirement if I need. I will say the requirement is documented at tenants MD. All right, if I do this, let's see if it gets that right. If it doesn't get that right, probably I might need to restart the IDE. So I can see now at least it is saying I will do it according to the documentation. Let's first create the tenant model class, which is actually the first step in my documentation. It has created the model class. It has used appropriate attributes for MongoDB as per the documentation. And now it is generating the repository classes. And sometimes you feel when you work with AI, it is too slow, even though it is generating things much faster than how we do. So the trick I use is If I feel it's too slow, I have two IDEs on two branches, and I actually work on two parallel functions on two branches and then merge it to the main if you feel it's too slow. But when I say it's too slow, it's still 100 times faster than a developer doing this. So can you see it is actually trying to read my instructions, and I'm going to stop it because it's actually going to read my instructions, endpoint, and trying to find how to implement the endpoint classes as well. I think it's a result of it reading through the all of the documentation, right? This is where you might need to, when you do the prompting, you might need to scope it out and say only do the repo functions as I did last time. Do not implement anything else, because it has the ability of reading other documentation and start implementing some other parts. You can actually give the total documentation and say, hey, implement it from bottom to top. It will still do the job. But when you break things into smaller parts, usually the quality is much higher. So let me see, it has created three files, tenant endpoint. I did not really let it generate that one. So I'm going to accept the two other files which it has created. Now I basically have the module classes done, and the repository class also implemented with the patterns which I have in my repository documentation. So it's the last step I have to do now is generate the endpoints. So I can say following docs at following docs at I'm going back to my documentation, which is here. I have end client endpoints, how to create endpoints. So if I just simply show you a documentation like this, it's basically talking about where to place the endpoint classes and what are the best practices in naming REST endpoint namings and all. Generate the endpoints for tenants. The tenant repo is, let me give it the tenant repo, which I just created, tenant repository, so that it knows. And the models are at, has created the models, tenants. I can skip giving this because the agent can find it also. So let's see how it handles. So you can see I'm saying following this particular documentation, generate endpoints for tenants. The repo is this, and model entity models are at this class. So one other neat trick I had seen doing was not just to ask it to generate code. I do it TDD way. I tell it first generate the unit tests for this, and then run the unit tests, and then develop code until unit tests pass. Right? I mean, that's a very smart way of getting the AI to think a little deeper than just asking it to implement something. And another trick I use in doing this is with if I have something which is more complex than this, because this is fairly straightforward, right? You know exactly what to do. This is CRUD operation. But if you want it to implement some algorithm, I would say before generating code, find 3 alternative ways of implementing it, and then evaluate which method is the best method for my project. And with that type of prompts, you get the AI to think. So you need to think about the AI agent just as a developer, and you need to give the context as much as possible for you to get a good output. Now let's see what has happened. I have it has implemented the tenant endpoint class, which is basically calling the repository. You can see it's doing the CRUD operations here. And it has, here it's interesting, right? This is not just it creating new code. It is reading the documentation, finding where to inject the dependencies, and it's doing dependency injection in this class. It's a single line change. And then you can see it has, this is existing class. It has added this map tenant endpoints just following the other classes. And I actually have all of the bad design, of course. You shouldn't have all of the endpoints in this class. But you can see it has added a method in this. And when you look at it, you understand it's not really blindly generating code, but it's following the given guidelines and the design and architecture of the document. I'll accept this, and for fun, we can do something like .NET build to see if it can build. Okay, fantastic. So it builds, and I probably can run this one. But for me to run this one, of course, I need a test suite, right? So let me do that final call to do a test suite. But if you have any question, please start shooting the questions. I can answer it just after writing this prompt. Following document or guidelines. I have a documentation about how to write a test suite, Postman test suite. But I'll just minimize these. Docs, non-functional, client Postman test. Create Postman script for testing tenants endpoints. Endpoints can be found at, I can give you the AI the endpoint class, but this is again interesting to see. I'm saying it to generate the endpoints for tenants, but this particular class has endpoints for all, pretty much all my application, right? Or this module of my application. But it will still, I believe, it will find the tenant endpoints and create a test for tenant endpoints only. Hopefully. I have a question. Are you using the free version of this tool? No, I'm not using the free version. I'm using the paid version, but free version has a limited number of tokens you can use, but paid version basically lets you have unlimited, pretty much, tokens. Yeah. This is Cursor, of course, yes. Any other question? So meanwhile, I probably should look for the token, because if I am to actually test this one, I need a token. From my, I'm going to steal a token. Yeah, you can of course look somewhere else until I steal this token. Where is the token? Yeah, this is a token. Yeah, if you probably, I hope you will not do a session hijack by copying the token. Yeah, so I have the test suite file generated here. So if I simply view the opening Finder, and if I go to Postman, now I have the test file, which I can simply drag and drop. And you can see it has created all of the endpoints. I don't really need to go and create any of it in here. So it has also created more like a set of variables here, because it knows my API requires an auth token and then tenant ID. And simply now I have all of the things set up. I probably should be able to call this, given that server is still running. So yeah. Procedure 4. It was not on the watch mode for it to get the hot reload of changes. Unauthorized. That is because no tenant ID found in tenant ID header. Yeah, I probably can debug this one. Why the test suite has not got the X tenant ID is tenant ID. Probably I need to save this one. Save and override 99xIO, get all tenants, send a request. Yeah, of course, right. You can see now I can actually get, you might wonder where it is getting the tenants, because I did this once before. These are the documents. Like I can actually see, you can see it's only one document here. If I create one other document by creating a new tenant in the body, it's using the tenant name. I will just replace this one. Simple. Tenant ID created, URL with UTC, and I send this one. And if I go to all tenants and send this again, you can see I get the, basically I finished the whole backend while I was doing the demo. Yeah, so this is this process, we call it GoVibe, and we had documented the whole process because it's very important. If you're doing vibe coding, you need to really ensure that the code generated is complying with your architecture. And how you do that is by keeping developer documentation together with code and using developer documentation as context. Super. So we have some questions. Have you tried Windsurf? How it is compared? I have tried Windsurf. It could be personal. I still like Cursor agent. I found it fairly powerful, the way it orchestrates its tools. But I haven't tried the latest version of Windsurf. But I might be biased, right? Because I haven't really worked a lot with Windsurf. How about privacy? Is a code uploaded for processing? Of course, code is uploaded for processing. But this is what I ask people when I say, okay, I'm uploading my code to OpenAI. People say OpenAI is backed by Microsoft. All of your code can be read by Microsoft or whatever, right? But then I ask, where is your code already hosted? It's in GitHub. Okay, GitHub is already owned by Microsoft, right? If you have your code with Microsoft, why are you worrying about parts of the code? Oh, where is your server hosted? It's hosted in Azure. That means all of your data and everything you are trusting somebody, of course, right? You can configure these tools to use a private model, either in Azure or your own hosted. It is possible to configure. If you are really worried about that level of, it's not a privacy case, more like confidentiality case. But then you need to first question, is my code and everything else is more exposed than my prompts, right? If it is more exposed, then there's no point fixing prompts. I think then we need to start taking code into a private network. Do I need external account on Cloud AI to use Sonnet model? If so, how does the billing works? I don't have external account. I only took the subscription from Cursor. But if you see some of these models here, like Sonnet Max model is priced on tokens. But if you have to use some of these models, you will need external token. If you have to use it unlimitedly, you will need external token. But for most type of coding we do, I don't see a need to do that. $20 subscription would work. Of course, the privacy, there's a privacy mode. The code is not stored. If enabled, cool. All including Cursor sub. Have you looked into MCP in increasing capabilities? How would that impact developing with Cursor? MCP is still new. We don't have a lot of tooling available MCP yet. But I think what is going to happen is you are able to connect with more custom servers. Like for an example, let's say I need to, I'm doing very custom type of development. Let's say SharePoint something, right? And Microsoft can actually host a MCP server with SharePoint specific information, SharePoint APIs, SharePoint specific information. And then if I configure that MCP server into my IDE, when I run a prompt, if it sees that it needs some information, it will actually use the MCP endpoint of Microsoft, which I have configured into Cursor in getting its work done. Or you can actually do, for an example, MCP. Another use case is here I can run any command prompt here. Like if I say commit my code, it'll simply commit my code, right? Because the agent has the terminal tool already built in. But imagine I need to deploy this in a custom way. And my deployment pipeline can have a MCP server to which I can execute some commands and deploy it somewhere, right? I could also say get my usage statistics for this particular component. And there's an MCP server somewhere else actually giving me Google Insights, giving me usage of a particular component I'm working on. Things like that, right? That is how MCPs would integrate it into Cursor. Reviewing AI generated by human. What is your opinion on reviewing AI? Of course, you need to review. Like I never commit without reviewing code. Never ever. I always review the code and ensure I understand. If I don't understand, I tell Cursor, hey, I don't understand this code. Make it dummy friendly or Hasid friendly. And then it basically does a fairly good job in explaining or simplifying the code. But you need to review your code. But interestingly, in future, I would believe code reviews will actually also be done by agents on server as you push, because code reviews a lot of times, unless it's very domain specific, we are reviewing for architectural constraints. And that set of architectural constraints we can feed to the AI model, just like I feed the documents here, and it will do the code review in line with the architectural constraints. If you have a GitHub Copilot license, you can use agent mode in VS Code. Yeah, I mean GitHub Copilot, I at least found it fairly primitive. Maybe it has changed compared to Cursor. Yeah, that basically concludes my demo. Any other question? Please use this website, because there are things which I haven't discussed in this website, like IDE rules. How do you set up IDE rules, and how do you differentiate IDE rules with the documentation in Markdown? I'll post this link. It's a temporary link, but tomorrow probably we will host this on govibe.dev. Then I will share the link once more. If no more questions or more questions.
Asit, in the MD doc files that you have in the repo, any tips that we can use to optimize it so that the Cursor picks it up better?
Yes, it's a good question. How do you? I'll talk about the optimization, but how do you also generate the documents? So what I do is I have a common prompt here. This is my doc generation prompt. So basically what I say is analyze the provided code samples and update the existing Markdown documentation accordingly. And there are certain rules that I'm giving. Identify and incorporate patterns from similar code samples. Ensure documentation is generic enough to support code generation while maintaining clarity, because sometimes it tends to create documentation very specific to that sample I'm giving. So I'm saying do not generate anything very specific, be generic. Only document the required scope, because AI is so passionate, right? If you ask it to do something, it starts doing everything, like we had seen a while ago. So you need to say what not to do also. And you may add examples. However, do not replace the content in docs wherever. So I'm saying you can add examples, but if there are other docs available, just refer to that doc, then copying the content. things like that, right? And always update docs.index if the new doc is not in the index, that is basically index.md. So I use this prompt, and then I simply, actually this has some best practices in documentation. So simply I would drag and drop this guy, doc generation. As per the guideline, generate a new documentation about how to handle authentication and authorization. Here are the samples, and I drag and drop samples, and it generates a documentation for me. And then I use that documentation in coding, right? So that is how you basically get into this cycle. So you have code, you generate documentation, you use documentation to generate code back. Yeah, thanks for that question. Probably we can end the session exactly 1 hour. Kalana, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Asit, for taking us through these practical examples that we can like adapt right away. And thank you all for joining this session. So if you have further questions, you can always, get back to like Hasit through email, or else like, start like, yeah, we will have multiple, like when the repo is shared, when the website is shared, that's a contributing option as well. So on the repo itself, we can create a discussion as well. And of course, when you learn to do things better in prompt driven development, we'd like to get those contributions so rest of us can learn from that as well. So thanks again for joining for today's session. See you all next time.
See you all.
Bye-bye.